Hello, everyone. I'm Eric Miller. I'm a professor in the Department of Civil and Mineral Engineering, and I'm director of Mobility Network. It is my pleasure to welcome you to Mobility Network's second session of the Way Forward in 2023 panel series. Before we start, we wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. To begin this session, I'd like to say just a few words about Mobility Network at the School of Cities, which is an institutional strategic initiative at the University of Toronto. 2 years ago, U of T recognized that the sustainable movement of people and goods is a global challenge that can only be addressed by a cross-disciplinary collaboration among university researchers and further through collaboration with public and partners in government and industry. Mobility Network is a group of about 70 researchers from across U of T's 3 campuses whose diverse interests span the broad scope of critical issues about mobility, and it is the University of Toronto's answer to that grand challenge. We've organized that broad expertise into 7 knowledge clusters. Of course, everything is connected to everything, but the organizing principle this organizing principle shows our focus on key challenge areas like equity and inclusion, land use and economy, climate change and health, emerging new mobility technology, and services. And let's not forget freight and urban goods movement. We wrap that in the green circle. I think we need the next slide, Judy. Do we?
I apologize, that slide, I'm not finding it.
Oh, okay, so we seem to be missing a slide.
Yeah.
So there should be a really nice Venn diagram showing you how all these knowledge clusters fit together. So maybe we'll just skip that part since we don't have the slide. So we have our knowledge clusters.
Sorry about that.
That try to organize people in different areas, overlapping areas, including analysis, modeling, governance, etc., technology, etc., etc. In any event, these then guide us in putting together our panel discussions of areas of interest. And this one that we're about to start is the second of 6 planned panels that will run every other week until mid-June. This week, our distinguished panel will be discussing safeguarding reliable, sustainable supply chains. And with that, I will pass it off to our moderator for today, Professor John Robinson. Over to you, John.
Thanks very much, Eric, and welcome everybody. Please note that this event is being recorded and will be shared after the webinar. I'm John Robinson, a professor in the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy and the School of the Environment, and U of T's presidential advisor on the environment, climate change, and sustainability. Today, I'm the moderator of our panel, Safeguarding Reliable, Sustainable Supply Chains. 3 years ago, many of us were staring at empty shelves in our grocery stores and realizing, if we hadn't before, the critical importance of reliable supply chains. Transportation is the largest GHG emitter by sector in Ontario, and the GTHA, in the GTHA, trucks alone account for 21% of greenhouse gas emissions. Our 3 panelists are here today to bring their perspectives to a discussion about our travel habits in the post-pandemic city, related to freight, where we are now and where we might be headed, and what that might mean for future freight travel demand. They're each going to take a few minutes to bring their perspectives to this discussion. Then I'll moderate a panel discussion and we'll take some questions. The chat has been configured so that you can message us directly. Please post your questions in the chat and we will get to them after the presentations. I'll introduce each of the panelists in turn, beginning with Daniel. Daniel Posen is an assistant professor in the Department of Civil and Mineral Engineering at the University of Toronto and the Canada Research Chair in System Scale Environmental Impacts of Energy and Transport Technologies. His research focuses on system scale environmental sustainability analysis and is grounded in the tools of life cycle assessment and life cycle thinking. Today, Daniel is going to provide an overview of the challenges of decarbonizing our freight systems. Over to you, Daniel. And I think you may need
I shared my screen and then I lost the toolbar that let me unmute, but I think I found it. So you are seeing my screen, correct?
Yes.
And you are hearing me, correct?
Yes.
All right, excellent. So thank you. Yeah, so the session today has a nice broad title, and I'm going to zoom in on one specific aspect about sustainable supply chains, which is decarbonizing freight, because that in and of itself is a massive question. I've subtitled it a brief tour of the IPCC assessment report. So I was a co-author on the transportation greenhouse gas mitigation chapter from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The talk has sort of gone in a slightly different direction, maybe than just IPCC, but I'll give you a bit of an overview of the way I think about this, because I do think about these systems in a fairly broad way, and I think you'll hear about more details from our other speakers. But generally, when we get to transportation greenhouse gas emissions and reducing emissions from the transportation sector broadly, we tend to look at these categories of avoid, shift, and improve. And this tends to be applied more to passenger transport, but there's absolutely no reason why it shouldn't be applied more to freight and goods movements. The idea that, number one, avoid. If you don't need to take a trip, if you don't need to ship something, if you can find ways of dematerializing our economy, decoupling our economic growth from moving things around, that's probably the first thing we should be doing. Shift. We can go from higher emitting to lower emitting modes. So in the passenger space, we know what that looks like. That's going from cars to public transit, for example. In the freight space, that often looks like going, say, from trucks to trains, although it's not quite as clear cut in the freight space. And then we move to improve, right? So if we're going to be moving things around by trucks anyway, how can we make sure that they are more efficient, using low carbon fuels, optimizing our trips, to optimizing routing, that kind of thing, to reduce the amount of distance that we're traveling, and those kind of things. It turns out that a lot of the IPCC report is focused on passenger vehicles, and the bit that is focused on freight, which is there, really lives pretty heavily in that improved section. And so a lot of what I'm going to be talking about over the next few minutes are just what are our other energy, what are our other fuel options? And that's really the kind of large-scale national and global perspective that I'm bringing today. I decided let's start by figuring out just what is that split in Canada. And I actually expected to be telling you a story around, well, how Canada, we're very dependent on cars compared to other places. It turns out actually we're doing okay for land freight. Red is good. It means we're using more rail, less road. Canada's closer to the red. So generally, we're actually ahead of the curve on doing a little bit more by rail than by trucks. But if we look at our national greenhouse gas inventory, and we look at what's been happening from 1990 to today, and I'm going to circle over here on the far left what the emissions were from heavy-duty trucks back in 1990 and what they are today. So freight overall emissions have increased 62% in that time, and trucks in particular have roughly doubled. So we've been making good progress, at least flattening, if not reducing, the emissions from passenger transport. We're not doing as well with freight, and it's in many ways a much harder question. So then let's move over to that improve box. So generally, across the energy sector, across different energy users, not just in transportation, often improve means electrify when you can. We like electricity. We like electricity for a lot of reasons. We know it can be made very low carbon through renewable electricity. We like direct use of electricity because it's often more efficient than turning it into some kind of chemical that we then have to burn, where we lose a lot of efficiency both on the conversion and on the final use of the fuel. And it does things like it gets emissions away from people, right? An electric car, electric truck, there's nothing going on in the tailpipe. We get to move that electricity generation to somewhere further away from where we live. So even to the extent that it's still polluting, that tends to look good. And so the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, was generally fairly bullish on the potential for electric vehicles, at least in the passenger sector. But things got a little bit more complicated when it came to freight. And so here I've originally captioned this figure as trucks, but actually it's really freight overall. I'd say many would argue that at this stage, we kind of know that at least on the technology side, and I think you're going to hear about from your other speakers, there's lots we can do that's not on the technology side. But at least on the technology side, we kind of know for passenger cars that electric vehicles are winning if we're doing a pure techno solution. But we actually don't know where we're going yet with trucks, with planes, with shipping. We might be able to do electricity. But there's some issues, right? When you're dealing with especially long haul trucking and big heavy vehicles that need high power demand, you're talking really large batteries, you're talking issues with slow charging, you're talking major infrastructure upgrades to be able to keep those trucks charged. And so although there is a big role probably for electricity to play, there's probably also a role for hydrogen, possibly also for other synthetic fuels. And so it's actually an exciting time where there's a big debate going on, where we don't really know what the energy source is yet, or what it's going to look like in 2050 for trucks and generally across the freight sector. So as I was sort of suggesting, I'll try and go through, there's a lot of text on these slides, but I wanted to illustrate because the IPCC had these bottom line take home messages. And for passenger transport, they were clear. We can do changes in urban form and behavior programs, make a big difference. I'll get my laser pointer with a high level of confidence. And battery electric vehicles, lower life cycle greenhouse gas emissions than combustion vehicles, especially if powered with low carbon energy, high level of confidence, fairly short, fairly clear statements. And here's what we get with freight. This is the take home bottom line summary statement, and it's long. And there's a reason it's long, it's because it's complicated. Like I said, we don't really know where we're going yet. So heavy duty trucks can be decarbonized through battery electric, so electric vehicles. But maybe needing electrified roadways, like how are we actually going to get those electric vehicles, but complemented with hydrogen and biofuel in some contexts. And this is with medium confidence. And some of these technologies are considered feasible by 2030 with medium confidence. And then for shipping and aviation, still require research and development through advanced, though we do have potential with advanced biofuels, ammonia, synthetic fuels emerging as viable options. And again, medium confidence. So we've got a lot of work to do figuring out how we're going to do this with freight. John, I apologize. I wasn't watching the clock. I'm probably getting close over time, so I'll do the next few slides quickly. Cut me off when you need to, or tell me when I have like a minute left. But so we have electricity. And again, as I said, we like electricity. Electricity is efficient and it has good ability to go low carbon. But we worry about things like the size of the battery and the weight of the truck, either making things heavier. 1 minute. All right. So we worry about things, the weight of the truck, the battery, all sorts of issues that you probably know about, we've heard about with batteries. So we have options, fast chargers, overhead wires, electrifying the roadways. They've all got good things about them. None of them are really ready for prime time yet. We've got biodiesel and renewable diesel. These are nice because they're relatively mature. We already do biodiesel in fairly large quantities around the world, and renewable diesel, a little bit more expensive, but a little bit of a better replacement for conventional diesel. It's great. It's a liquid fuel. We can incorporate them to a large extent in our existing supply chains, but big controversies over the greenhouse gas emissions and how much benefits do we actually get out of doing biofuels, and potentially other limits to whether they actually help with air quality, how much can we make around the world. We can go to synthetic fuels. We can take carbon dioxide. We can take hydrogen. We can mesh them together, pump in a ton of energy, and just make renewable diesel that way through synthetic fuels, electrofuels, and put it in right in our existing trucking system. That's great. It works with our existing system, but it's terribly inefficient, needs a huge amount of energy, and it's currently about 3 times the price. And then we get the hydrogen and other derivatives. So hydrogen is one of the leading contenders at the moment. Other derivatives like ammonia. So ammonia, really, we're just making it from hydrogen. Same thing with these synthetic fuels. Really, it's just a way to store the hydrogen energy. This is a big, complicated graph in terms of what the emissions look like from these different fuels. But I'm going to put on a big green bar here. It's actually not that complicated. We got to get to near zero emissions. So anything that isn't near zero, I don't want to look at so much. So the synthetic fuels, if they're made with very low carbon, very, very low carbon electricity, they do well. Electric vehicles with low carbon electricity do well. Hydrogen and ammonia with low carbon electricity, they do well. We have to think about the efficiency and how much low carbon electricity we have, but a lot of the other options I don't want to pay much attention to. Costs, a little bit more complicated. I'll just say very briefly, right now, diesel trucks are the cheapest, right? We just sort of know that. But with projections for cost declines coming with hydrogen and batteries, we can probably get to cheaper with over the next 20, 30 years, hopefully over the next 10, but I'm not so sure about that, but with electricity or with hydrogen, but we're not there yet. The key is that we are not there yet, and that development is needed. I had a few other messages I would say, but I'm over that 1 minute John gave me, probably had too many slides. I will stop talking.
Thanks very much, Daniel. So some uncertainty, I think, is a fair way to summarize part of what Daniel was telling us about. Next up is Adam. And Adam, can you turn on your camera? Dr. Adam Thorne is the director of the Pembina Institute's transportation program. For several years, Pembina has been addressing the role that freight plays in the Canadian economy and the challenges and opportunities for reducing emissions from goods movement. Adam holds a doctorate in public policy from Toronto Metropolitan University and master's and bachelor's degrees in political science from Western. Today, Adam is going to talk about how we will get things done in Canada. Over to you, Adam.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for the Mobility Network for putting this on and having the opportunity to talk to you today. So as was stated, my name is Adam Thorne. I'm the director of the transportation program for the Pembina Institute. For those of you who don't know, the Pembina Institute is a clean energy think tank helping to lead Canada's transition to clean energy. We do so through research, through advocacy, and of course, through convening. I want to talk a little bit about Canada's climate commitments, and particularly when it comes to Canada's pathway forward when it comes to medium and heavy duty vehicles. I think Daniel's sort of a talk, I think, set up this very nicely for me, so thank you. So just a couple of things to note. Canada has made some ambitious commitments when it comes to reducing greenhouse gases across Canada. So 40 to 45% below 2005 levels. And of course, net zero by 2050. These are really ambitious targets. Ambition is good, but of course, we need a pathway. We need a strategy to get there. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the strategy that we are recommending to the federal government to move this forward. So a couple of things to keep in mind. In 2022, Canada released the Emission Reduction Plan 2030. It lays out a number of goals when it comes to the medium and heavy duty vehicle sector, which is what I'm going to call broadly freight, but obviously encompasses a little bit more than that, and I'll talk about that just a little bit today as well. So the two numbers that I want to focus on is that they committed to reaching 35% of total medium and heavy duty vehicle sales being zero emission vehicle by 2030 and 100% by 2040 where feasible. And by zero emission vehicle, of course, we mean vehicles with no tailpipe emissions. And so that, generally speaking, at this point at least, means battery electric vehicles or hydrogen. So what are we trying to do with the strategy that we are proposing? We are trying to impact deep emission reductions to help Canada meet those targets. We want to do so through accelerated deployment of zero emission vehicles. This needs to happen through creating market certainty, and I'll get to that in just a moment. And of course, we want to do this in a way that protects public health and public well-being, while also growing Canada's economy and supporting Canadian innovation. So obviously, these are really broad goals and really difficult things to do all within a single strategy. I'm going to talk about one particular aspect of the strategy, something that's been in the news a lot when it comes to decarbonizing zero emission vehicle sales standard. I do want to recognize, though, that of course that there are a lot of other policies that need to happen at the same time in Canada when we talk about a standard. So this is not to suggest overall that we don't need incentives and subsidies and capacity building and all of those other components. And of course, those other aspects that Daniel talked about when we talked about avoiding and shifting these modes of transportation to contribute to decarbonization. I'm going to talk a lot about that third category, that is improve. So we've rooted our strategy, our recommendations here in what's called a beachhead strategy. This is something CalSTART developed. I think it's actually quite intuitive. And what it simply recognizes is that some categories of vehicles are relatively ready for that transition to zero emission vehicles today. So for example, transit buses, school buses, we're already seeing, really fairly large pilot projects, and in fact, many transit authorities and school districts moving to these vehicles already. I think I would categorize medium and duty vehicles as well. And these are the urban delivery vehicles that we see so often. These are the medium duty vans, for example. On the other end of the spectrum, of course, we have heavy duty. And I think that uncertainty that Daniel sort of talked about is absolutely key to remember when we're talking about heavy duty vehicles. These vehicles do not return to base at the end. They need very fast recharging times. We typically think that at least some of them will need to be hydrogen, but the pathway to reaching hydrogen, of course, is really uncertain. So we need a strategy that really recognizes that different aspects or different segments of the medium and heavy duty vehicle sector are more or less ready. So what we've been proposing is a zero emission vehicle sales standard. And of course, I think this has been in the media an awful lot when it comes to light duty vehicles. Again, I think Daniel is absolutely right. We've made really significant advances when it comes to decarbonizing passenger cars in Canada. And I think the proposed LDV sales standard will accelerate this even further. What we're proposing here is actually extending this to medium and heavy duty vehicles to a sales standard that would require manufacturers and importers to ensure that a specific percentage of their total fleet are zero emission standards. Of course, that total percentage would go up over time. In order to support this recommendation, we've actually developed some modeling that I think really demonstrates that this is the best pathway to reaching Canada's 2030 and 2040 ERP targets. So on the far right-hand side, you can see the baseline. This was the baseline in 2022. Of course, a few new policies and infrastructure funding have been announced since then, but you can see with our existing mix of policies, based on our modeling at least, we don't come close to meeting the 2030 or the 2040 targets. That's that 35% by 2030 and 100% by 2040. Incentives. This is purchase incentives for vehicles that help those who want to purchase zero emission vehicles be able to do so. We know these vehicles are considerably more expensive at this point. Until we reach cost parity, we know subsidies will be a really important part of this overall policy picture. But we can see here that subsidies on their own clearly do not help us reach those targets. Again, they're incredibly important, particularly when it comes to equity, but they're not nearly going to be enough. What is required is a sales standard. So on the green line there is our recommended zero emission vehicle mandate. This is based on what we call a beachhead strategy. That recognizes that we can be quite aggressive when it comes to buses, when it comes to medium duty vehicles, and recognizing that we'll have to be less aggressive when it comes to pushing for zero emission vehicles in the heavy duty vehicle categories. And you can see here, based on our modeling, that this meets both the 2030 target and comes very close to the 2040 ERP targets. We really think this is the best policy that's going to help Canada reach these ambitious goals. So here is this the mandate disaggregated by vehicle class. And so you can see, again, we're recommending a really aggressive trajectory when it comes to buses and medium duty vehicles. Thank you. A more modest trajectory when we're talking about medium duty vehicles, and a much more moderate trajectory when we're talking about heavy duty vehicles. Again, this is the category in which there's far more uncertainty, and we recognize that. The hope here is that by being aggressive in these earlier categories, that technology and the learnings that are going to happen here are going to trickle up to those heavy duty vehicles. So why a sales standard? Well, it achieves or comes very close to achieving the 2030 and 2040 goals laid out in the ERP targets. It achieves substantial greenhouse gas reductions by 2050. That is, all sales standard scenarios that we tested result in an average of 90% reduction of emissions below the 2005 levels and reaching 5 megatons by 2050. Reduces energy consumption more than any other scenarios that we tested. It induces larger and faster declines in technology costs. This is, of course, essential. We want these vehicles to reach cost parity as quickly as possible. And then, of course, it reduces compliance risks because it creates that market certainty. We think this is absolutely essential in order to incentivize, for example, the investment in charging infrastructure. Nobody's going to want to invest in the substantial funding that this is going to require unless there is some market certainty that they're going to be able to recoup their investments. And so we think a sales standard is by far the most advantageous policy that Canada can adopt to reach that 2030 and 2050 goals. Hopefully I slid in there under my time, or at least very close to it. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Adam. So next up is Councillor Dianne Saxe. Dianne, can you turn your cameras on? I see, good. Dr. Dianne Saxe is one of Canada's most respected environmental and energy lawyers. She previously served as the Environmental Commissioner of Ontario and Deputy Leader of the Green Party of Ontario. Now Councillor Saxe is proud to serve Ward 11, University-Rosedale, where she has deep roots and wide networks. Today, Councillor Saxe is going to put this into the perspective of the many issues councillors like her must grapple with when a new technology is introduced into the public realm. Over to you, Dianne.
Well, thank you. Great to hear from Daniel and Adam. I'm big fans, of course, of the work of Pembina and the IPCC, so thank you. My focus, of course, is the City of Toronto, where long distance transport is from Scarborough. And all of my ward is a dense urban area, and the problems that freight presents in a dense urban area, we don't get an awful lot of long distance trucks, but we have lots of problems with trucks and freight generally, and that includes the health impacts, particularly of the pre-2008 diesel engines, which are so disproportionate in making the air dirty. We have the direct impact that trucks have in making it unsafe to cycle in the city, especially when they block bike lanes and kill cyclists. And the role that freight plays in undermining local retail, which is absolutely essential for 15-minute neighborhoods and vibrant downtown areas. The avoid, improve, shift framework is great. I am not going to talk about improve. So I focus on the other two. First of all, on avoiding. What can we do so that we don't need to move so much stuff so far? And some of that is a question of local production, things like urban agriculture. Some of it's about making stuff last. So things like Repair Cafe and any other standards that we use for durable goods. Some of it's about urban form. And some of it is about road tolls and anything we can do to disrupt the economics of having distant warehouses where you then drive everything to where the people are. So those are all things that I look for opportunities to do. But the main thing I'm working on is shift, especially in dense urban areas. I don't care what kind of truck it is. We're much better off if it's not in a truck. So anything that can be delivered by bike, maybe on foot, maybe by those little robots, those are going to be better for the city. And particularly moving stuff by bike has enormous financial benefits. It has air quality benefits. It has vision zero benefits. It's not fun being hit by a bike, but you're not likely to die. You get hit by a heavy truck, most people die. There's the climate pollution, there's congestion, there's the damage to the roads, which we can't afford to fix anymore. And then, of course, there's the cost of small businesses, and the small businesses in my area, and I have 22 of the 83 business improvement associations in all of Toronto. These businesses are really suffering. They got hammered during COVID. COVID is, of course, not really over. And they're still having lots of serious consequences. So any way that gets their goods around without having to pay the cost of a diesel truck is an important benefit for them. We also have to take into account not only the enormous congestion we have already, but all the things Metrolinx is going to do to try to break Toronto over the next few years. So looking out of my window at City Hall, I'm looking at Queen Street, and that's going to be closed as of 2 weeks from now. I guess 2.5 weeks from now. And it's going to be closed for years. So getting around downtown in a truck is going to be abominable, and it's going to make everybody else's life abominable. So we need to move everything we possibly can on a bike. How do we make that happen? Well, some of it is urban form, and we're working very hard on intensification. I hope you folks all know that Toronto is by far the fastest growing major municipality in North America. We have more growth going on here than in, I think, the fastest growing 7 US cities put together. We've got about 250 cranes going in Toronto right now. The fastest growing US city is Los Angeles, and they have about 50 cranes. So there's 280 development applications in my ward at any one time. So we are going through enormous intensification right now, which means a lot more people, a lot more density, a lot more congestion, and a lot more need to move so much stuff so far. Bike lanes, tremendously important in turning over more public road space from cars and trucks to these lighter, cheaper, in many ways faster, less polluting, safer vehicles. And so we're working very hard on that. The cycling plan's coming to Infrastructure Environment Committee next week, as well as our carbon budget and the Transform TO action plan and the net zero action updates. And if anybody's got time to put a little time into supporting good public policy. Next Wednesday, don't miss it. We have bike share is growing enormously, and it's going to have 20% e-bikes, which can be used for a variety of small kinds of part of the transportation. This is one of the biggest successes in Toronto's transportation history. More people used bike share last year than bought tickets to every major sporting event in the city put together. And it's growing dramatically. We're expecting to have about 10,000 bikes across the city in the next 2 years, including 2,000 e-bikes. And so one of the things I'm doing in my work with the development projects is building out e-bike stations. So again, those of you got nothing better to do but to read city minutes, you will have seen that last week in approving a new development on Bloor Street, one of the things I got from them was 2 e-bike stations near Bloor and Avenue Road. The version 4 of the Toronto Green Standards has got increasing bike storage, including 15% requirement for plugs, so that we will have, hopefully that'll be going to 20% in version 5. We are also working through our fire department with fire standards to deal with lithium-ion battery fires, which is a growing problem when people use cheapo batteries or don't use the right chargers. We've got an e-cargo bike pilot project, well, several of them. So FedEx, Perlator, DHL starting next month. You probably have seen, if you've watched, that we have 2 mini hubs, one at the University on St. George and one at Spadina and Bloor, where Perlator is allowed to store its e-cargo delivery bikes and have basically an office where people can drop off and pick things up. The mini hubs, and these are being also managed, at least the one on St. George is partly managed by the Transportation Research Institute at the university, and the data is being collected. So we're also looking at charging fees for the use of curb space, big fines for blocking bike lanes, anything else we can do to make it easier, safer, and faster to move people and stuff by bike.
Thanks, Anne. Right on time. Okay, so we have a bit of time just for discussion among the panel, and I will invite each of you to ask any of the others any question you have, and I'll maybe kick it off by a question about energy supply, because what was pretty clear, Daniel, from your presentation, which is focusing, of course, on the improved side of things, that low carbon electricity or zero carbon electricity is actually essential, without which none of those improvements really matter, right? The shifts in technologies. So is the transportation problem really just an energy supply problem from the point of view of the improve category?
Yeah, I was about to say, I'm sure Dianne will fight back and say, no, it's not just an energy supply problem. I think coming from like these very large international reports, it's really hard to think about local conditions. And so that's why one of the reasons they really do think about improving if you're looking for global coordination. To a large extent, it is an energy supply problem, but there's a lot of technical issues along the way. And you're right, so even things like hydrogen or synthetic fuels, really, those are just other ways of storing electricity, right? Biofuels are maybe the only one that's a way of storing sunlight. So this is one of the issues I have sometimes when you look at the life cycle assessment studies of these things. They say, well, as long as everything's with really low carbon electricity, these all look great. The problem is these things use a lot of electricity. And so like these synthetic fuels, like absolutely, if everything's powered by wind, no problem. But that's a lot of wind, and that's not an easy thing to do. And so I think you really can't forget about the conservation piece and finding ways to use less energy, because the amount of low carbon energy we're going to need across all sectors is currently outstripping our capacity to produce it.
Which is why bikes make so much sense. Why spend so much electricity hauling around thousands of pounds of metal?
Right. So let's turn to the to that side of it, to the avoid side. I wanted to ask a question about the famous last kilometer or last mile, because this is a big part of a shift that's occurring with online shopping in particular, right? The last mile is difficult by all reports. What is the feeling here? Dianne, I know exactly what you're going to say on this, and I've worked in Copenhagen where, you know, the SUV is a cargo bike. So I've seen the power of biking to do that. My question really is, how far can we go with the increase in online shopping that's happening, or is that become part of the policy mix, is to address that question? How far can we go with bikes in terms of that delivery? And I think you mentioned the Purolator example that's happening on campus here is an example of exactly that. So how far can this take us? And maybe I'll throw that open to everybody.
Well, I don't think anybody has really found the end. It's cheaper, right? It's so much cheaper. It takes up a lot less space in crowded downtown areas. It's faster. It's definitely faster for me to cycle to work than it is to drive to work. And as I say, the congestion is going to be unbearable over the next 5 years at least, with the Metrolinx construction on top of everything else, plus some people being afraid of the TTC.
Longer distances.
I think that there's an enormous unmet demand for cycling, and but we have to make it safe. So as we remove obstacles, you know, we talk about induced demand for cars, but it's also true for bikes. When it becomes safe to bike to work, more people bike to work. When it becomes easy to move stuff around on a bike downtown because there's a bike lane and a safe place to unload it, suddenly a lot more people do it. We know that there's an enormous financial crunch, particularly on small business. And so anything that reduces their costs is something they're going to want. And bikes can be a lot cheaper.
Okay, how about the not last mile, the distance between the original source and that last mile delivery? So we say bicycles are actually a great response to that last mile question. What about the intermediate distances? Daniel and Adam, what do you think are the possibilities there? Is it a truck? We didn't hear much about rail versus truck. We heard a lot about trucks. Is that something we should be looking more seriously at?
Adam, you want to go first? You want me to?
I'm happy to go first. I think absolutely. And I think, you know, this also goes back to bikes as well. You know, when we're talking about these solutions, it's not either or, it's definitely an and as well. I mean, we need to be adding these solutions together. So whether it's changes in modes, whether it is simply reducing the number of packages that are being shipped, whether it is the shift in these vehicles to more energy efficient vehicles, to zero emission vehicles, all of these things need to be happening simultaneously, which I think is, you know, where the big challenge really is in this. So absolutely, I think, you know, mode shifts have to be part of this.
Yeah, I guess what I say again with that avoid, shift, improve framework, I mean, it's not often presented as a hierarchy, but I think it is a hierarchy, right? You avoid what you can, shift what you can, and then you improve what's left. The problem is that what's left is often really big. And so, bikes are better than trucks by far. Rail, where it makes sense, because actually rail is not uniformly better than trucks, but where it makes sense can be a lot better. But the problem is truck emissions have been growing in just about every country in the world, especially because of these longer distances. And so, yeah, as I say, you shift where you can, but there's going to be, I don't think there's going to be a world in which we're not moving stuff by trucks, and they're going to probably continue to have the lion's share of the emissions. And that's why we spent a lot of time thinking about, all right, well, what are those alternate fuels? But I very much agree with that hierarchical perspective on it.
And let's not forget that we have one of the reasons we have so much truck emissions is that we have created an economic incentive to build your storage and your manufacturing somewhere far away and then just truck it, because trucking is free at the point of use in the road. We don't charge for the use of the road. We don't charge for the use of parking, not nearly enough. And so we've created the incentive where it makes sense to build a warehouse on what should be our food land and then drive trucks all over the place. And that incentive can be changed by government action. It's a politically very difficult thing to do, but technically it's easy.
At the urban scale.
At the urban scale. but most of the customers are in urban areas.
How about changing the points of production?
Well,
Yes.
exactly. That's where I started, is that we can grow some food in the city, and we should, because if there are any disruptions, we're helpless. Toronto is highly vulnerable. We have, of course, only a quarter of our electricity production and almost none of our food. So if there was a serious disruption, in the same way that people started running out of food in BC when that highway was washed out, we are also very vulnerable. So reshoring some production, bringing some production back into the city. One of the things the city is working on is what they call expanded options in neighborhoods, so that we can have more businesses and more making stuff back in where people live.
Though I guess that there are advantages to making sure we keep large industrial centers out further away from where people live. I guess right now things look a little bit different if everything's on clean energy. But if I've got something burning fossil fuels, I'm glad it's not down the street from me. But
I agree. But the thing is, we don't have to be just a bedroom community and a bank.
Right. Although I'm reminded of the Chinese policy of local steel plants, which didn't actually work.
I'm not
too well.
talking about steel.
Right, but there will still be steel happening.
That's fine. That's a great thing for them to do in Sault Ste. Marie.
Okay, so we won't get into intercity rivalry issues in this conversation. But how about the volume of freight? Is it a law that it's just going to increase over time? Is there a dematerialization possible of the products that we use to some degree? Can that be part of the picture? Start at the Daniel, go ahead.
Yeah, if you want to start at the top end. So there's evidence we've been making on the passenger side. We've been able to make progress. So just generally across the world, dematerialization is a thing, right? The resource intensity of our economies, not necessarily the resource use, but the resource intensity per unit of GDP has been, we've shown an ability to decouple, at least in relative terms. And with passenger transport, we've started showing that ability as well. We haven't seen it yet with freight. The global numbers don't bear that out. Now, that doesn't mean we couldn't do it, but it hasn't been happening yet. And in fact, again, freight is one of the fastest growing sectors, the fastest growing emission sectors, especially with global supply chains and things that have actually done a nice job reducing passenger transport, like e-commerce, have actually just boosted the amount of freight demand. So I'm hopeful. But I don't know if, and this could be my own lack of knowledge. I don't actually know of anywhere that has achieved it.
So
thinking about the cost, right? I mean, I suspect if you plotted the proportional cost of shipping against the increase in shipping, they would pretty much match. Shipping has been increasingly cheap, especially in proportion to the value of the goods, and naturally it would increase under those circumstances. If it's more expensive, I expect it to decrease.
I buy that.
Right, but there's also the cost of the goods themselves. Is if the end user is not just paying the shipping costs, so it's a relative decline. What's happening to the intensity, resource intensity of the goods we buy, or the volume of?
But it depends what you're thinking about. If you're thinking about food, I mean, we used to grow a lot of lamb in Ontario, and not very far from where people ate it. And the economics changed so that it was cheaper to ship lamb from New Zealand, and most of the sheep farmers in Ontario were driven out of business. The transportation has been unbelievably cheap.
Well, the famous life cycle assessment of lamb was that New Zealand lamb was a lower life cycle environmental impact than English lamb in England. This was a study that people just didn't believe, so it got a lot of criticism, but as far as I understand it, it held up, and it had to do with freight. And the way shipping is actually a fairly low impact way to carry materials compared to trucks or even.
There's been
rail.
a fair bit of work done on food miles, right? And it turns out that what you eat is a lot more important than where it came from, right? Eat less meat, probably more important than eating local. But I mean, the collective contribution from freight is very big, and it just happens that food, especially meat, is particularly greenhouse gas intensive, and so that the transportation tends to fall away. But that's not the case with all goods.
No, but food miles becomes a better indicator of social impact, about local, buying local and building local capacity than environmental impact. I don't know if that applies to other forms of commodity, but France's policy on common agricultural program is about culture and social aspects as much as it is about environmental impacts. French diet may not be particularly environmentally benign. Maybe it is. I don't know. We have a question in the chat that I thought I would throw out. Thanks for your insightful presentations and discussions. However, I have a comment. All of the suggested policies were focused on the carrier, mainly bikes or electrification of vehicles. Nonetheless, I want to put your attention to how carriers just respond to the other stakeholders in the supply chain. So policies that aim to change the behavior of the demand, e.g. off-hour deliveries, staggered deliveries, or changes in the land use, e.g. freight-efficient land use, are critical if we want to have sustainable supply chains. Any comments on that? I think it's not inconsistent with what you've been saying.
And as is so often the case, these things are much simpler in theory than they are in practice. So when you talk about nighttime deliveries, that is more efficient in a sense in the use of road space, which is less occupied during the night. However, the extra trucking at night wakes people up, which has many health costs and social impacts. And there has to be somebody awake and working at the receiving institution to receive it. So you're increasing the costs materially. And if it's a small business, they don't have anybody who can be staying up to 2 a.m. to receive the whatever, because they've got to work all day. And we have something like 9,000 buildings in Toronto where people live where there's no air conditioning. So the windows have to be open at night, especially in the hotter weather. And they expect a lower level of noise at night. So these things are much less simple when you consider the larger impacts, especially if you're talking about noisy trucks. Now, if you go to electric vehicles, which are as close to silent as possible, then you're not going to be waking people up. So that's a very good thing. But then we still have to have some way of delivering the goods. Some things could be delivered into a locker, I suppose. But for larger quantities where you need somebody or anything has to go into refrigeration, you still have the problem of greatly increasing the cost for the receiver.
Yeah, I guess I'll add, I freely admit I'm a technologist, right? Partly that's my expertise. I look at the energy carriers. Partly I sort of believe it. I really think there is a strong role for that. And it's partly because there's just a lot of inertia in the system. And even if we can imagine a better system than the one we have, we don't get to start from scratch. And so that's why one of the reasons I tend to focus on the energy carriers. If we can swap out a bad one for a slightly less bad one, I guess, again, you're always going to have impacts, but I'll say a bad one for a slightly less bad one. And people continue what they're doing. You can often make faster progress. And it actually brings me back. I was thinking a little bit more, John, about your rail question from earlier, right? That more rail would be great. We don't really have time to build up a whole new rail network. And the embodied emissions of doing that, sort of, again, the overall rail is better in its life cycle, but over the next 20 years, it's going to take a while to pay back. And so one of the reasons I start at that endpoint is I think, what can we do that doesn't require massive political capital and a massive upending of the system? Even if the system needs upending, I feel like we can make more progress without doing that sometimes.
Absolutely. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was simply going to say I absolutely agree, but I do think that we do need to be thinking also about those long-term solutions. That it shouldn't be a choice between them. That absolutely we should be doing what we can quickly and in areas in which we can have that impact immediately. But for example, the urban form, that's certainly not going to change overnight. But it should change. And so how do we sort of begin to move forward on that while at the same time affecting these more short-term impacts that we can.
And then maybe I'll just add one more. Oh, sorry. Do you mind? Just one last thing, which is I think you sort of, if you start to separate out maybe the climate change question from the everything else question, right? So low carbon energy, great, you've sort of solved climate change, but there's all these other huge benefits to having better urban form and to having it's not just about climate change, right? It's about safety, it's about air quality. It's, active transport has huge health benefits, community benefits. So it's to me, I think the easiest way to deal with greenhouse gas emissions probably is low carbon energy, but there's all these other things that we should care about, and that's maybe how you bridge a little bit of let's deal with climate change quickly now with low carbon energy, but let's keep in mind that we can still build a better world for all these other metrics.
Yeah, and that raises, Adam, your point, I think, raises the question of whether the short-term measure.
Uh-oh, did we lose John?
Sorry.
I lost you for a minute there. I don't know if it was just me.
Well, my question was whether the short-term measures that are the most effective are the ones that take us to the long-term solution. Because you have this question of lock-in that can happen, right? Especially with highly capital-intensive systems like transportation systems. So is there a possible tension between what we want to do long-term and what we want to do short-term?
Absolutely. Let me give you an example. Fire trucks. So I'm very proud of our fire service. They are the North American pioneers they have designed from scratch a totally electric pumping truck, where the engine, the motor has to not only move the truck, but it has to also pump the water. So there's an enormous energy demand. It's a very complicated thing to do. They've ordered 2 of them. We should have them next year. It's very exciting, but nobody knows yet how well they're going to work. And right now we have 30 2008 fire trucks, pumpers. Not only are they highly polluting in terms of toxic air contaminants, but they're 15 years old and we're not allowed to keep operating 15-year-old fire trucks. So we have to replace 30 fire trucks before we can get electric fire trucks. So we have to buy diesel fire trucks at an enormous expense, exactly when the last thing I want to be doing is locking us in to more diesel, but we have to replace the fire trucks right now, and we can't get electric fire trucks right now, etc.
Okay, last question, because we're getting close to time here from the chat. Should we just ban diesel? I get each of your views on that question.
I'd love to, but what do I do about fire trucks?
Bike, obviously, bike-based fire service delivery. Other thoughts? Adam, Daniel, what do you think about banning diesel?
In the long run, absolutely. In the short term, that's going to be a difficult task. But I think in the long run, that's absolutely the goal. Anything that is not zero emission should be ultimately, our goal to eliminate those. It's a question of how do we move forward across those different vehicle segments. Tomorrow, maybe we could ban diesel buses, but I'm not sure about heavy duty vehicles. That's going to be a longer term challenge.
Yeah, I largely agree with that answer, that I think part of the problem is we're not quite ready with the alternatives yet, and there's a lot still to build up, but there's nothing quite like a ban to get us moving. So I was an economist before I was an engineer, and I was taught to love market mechanisms and just price it correctly, let the market figure it out, and heavy-handed bans aren't the way to do it. It turns out market-based mechanisms don't always work as well as you think they do, and sometimes you do just need to step in and ban things, like what we did with CFCs, or like the ozone depleting chemicals. So yeah, eventually a ban would be nice, but for freight, no, I don't think we're ready for it.
The comment in the chat says that some cities have simply banned diesel vehicles. an action that was upheld in Germany by their Supreme Court. I don't know the story there, but it sounds like in Germany, there's a slightly more ambitious view of the potential for diesel bans.
Well, and I think probably like for an urban center, urban core, probably maybe we are ready to do that pretty soon. But like long haul trucking, I don't think so.
I think it was an air quality issue primarily, not nitrous oxides and so on. That was a big issue in England as well. Everybody has to breathe, and as we saw just last week, traffic-related air pollution, it takes an enormous toll on human health. So faster we can move towards cleaner air, the better.
Okay, so to sum up, on avoid, we have bikes being suggested as a significant step.
Bikes are for shift. Bikes are for shift. Local urban agriculture is for avoid.
Oh, sorry. On the shift, we have bikes. On the improve, we have low carbon electricity, coupled with a lot of uncertainty about how the technology is unfolding and the consequences of that. So with that, I'd like to turn things over to Judy to close us out. And thanks very much, Dianne, Adam, and Daniel.
Thank you, John.
And yeah, thank you, everybody. Thanks very much. Thanks very much, John, for hosting that session. Thanks to the panelists for your really, really interesting comments. And thanks to everybody who joined us. We hope that we'll see you again, because this was only the second in the series of 6 sessions that we're using to explore the way forward. And we'll be back in a couple of weeks to talk about data and considering access, ethics, and practice of data mobility policies. And then we'll be back every 2 weeks after that for discussions on other important topics in mobility. Registration is open for all 4 sessions. You can find out about it by subscribing to our newsletter. You can find out about it on our website. You get reminders if you subscribe to our newsletter, which you can also do on the websites. And you can also always find out more by contacting us. Thank you very much. Go safely out there into the streets and keep sharing the streets. Thanks very much. Bye, everybody.